Welcome back to the Dirty Digger podcast. Today we have Neel, the CEO and founder of Eclipse. Welcome, Neel.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Okay, Neel, so what I understand is you got a background in TradFi, Citadel to be exact. Why don't you first tell me about what it was like working in that industry?
So right before that, I was actually at Airbnb. I was a software
Ah,
engineer, moved over to Citadel, was initially a software engineer there, and then moved into a quant research role.
that's quite the jump.
And that was very different than like Web 2 software engineering, mostly because of the pace. It moves a lot faster, but the work was more interesting to me at least. I mean, I'm sure there are interesting teams at Airbnb, but at least for my background and my like natural propensities, there weren't too many fields that let me dive into economics, computer science, math, and just kind of focus on whatever was most interesting. So I thought it was uniquely suited for my skill set. So I liked working at Citadel, actually. I was in the commodities group. I wasn't doing anything controversial, such as the guys in equities with all the GameStop stuff at that time. So yeah, it was a really good experience for me.
That's awesome. And then, so how long do you do that? And then, what was the jump into crypto? When was the moment we were like, I got to change, I got to do a 90?
So I was doing that for a couple of years, and one of my friends who actually convinced me to join Citadel, he didn't even end up joining, and he went and started his project in the Solana space called Friction.
Okay.
And I don't know if you're familiar with that
I've heard,
project,
I've heard of,
but
yeah.
that, yeah. So he was working on that, and he was having a great time, and things were going well in Solana. And I was continuing to work at Citadel. I went to the Solana Hacker House in January of last year.
Okay.
So that was in Chicago. They rented out all of Tau. He gave a little talk, and it was a great time. I flew out shortly after, and then I met some folks that were also working crypto who I went to college with. And they were telling me, hey, you should totally quit your job and do crypto. I was like, oh, I can't. I have my bonus on the way, and that's not. And then my bonus came in, and I was like, I should quit now. So I did that, and I was just playing around with stuff in the Cosmos space, and ultimately found my way to this whole SVM L2 idea, which is what I started working on in about September of last year.
That's awesome. It's a good story. I think it seems like you're on the right track, anyways, which is perfect. Let's now jump into Eclipse. So Eclipse, as it is an Ethereum for settlement and security. You're using Risk Zero for your fraud proofs. You got Celestia for data availability, and you've got Solana for the virtual machine. Now, sounds simple, but I think it causes confusion for a little bit of people. So why don't you take a moment to give a little bit of the TLDR for you guys and what all that means?
Totally. So one correction there is people say that we use Ethereum for settlement and security. And I think that the correct framing is all these components are involved in the security of Eclipse
Hmm.
because security is a process. It can't really be replicated from only one blockchain. And it's also relevant because, for example, the data availability layer has implications on things like safety. But the high level way to think about an Eclipse transaction is through its lifecycle.
Okay.
So a transaction is received by the sequencer for Eclipse, it's ordered, and that ordering is committed to, and that's immediately posted to some L1. So the way that Eclipse is built, that's posted to Celestia, but for Optimism, Arbitrum, these are typically posted directly to Ethereum. And the difference between those two options is that one, Celestia offers this feature called data availability sampling.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is, as a phone or as a really lightweight device, you can see that those transactions were actually made available to everyone. And that's important because in order for full nodes to keep up with the network, they all need to have access to the transactions that were posted. Or in order for an optimistic rollup to generate a fault proof, they need
Mm-hmm.
to have access to the transactions. So there's various times when you need access to the transactions that were executed, and that's what the DA layer is fundamentally providing. So transactions are posted, but now we don't know the result of those transactions. So at this point, someone has to execute those transactions and make a commitment, and that's made to the settlement layer. And that commitment can take various forms for rollups in general. For Eclipse, it's basically making a commitment to the inputs and outputs for the transactions. So that's a commitment is like a weird cryptographic term, but it's a way of saying these bits uniquely represent what I think the correct inputs and outputs are for the transactions that I just executed. So you post that to Ethereum, and then for a ZK rollup, you'd also give some additional evidence, and you'd say, and then here's the evidence that that commitment's even correct. We don't do that because ZK proving every single transaction, at least the way that we built it right now, would be prohibitively expensive. So instead, we just post that, And then if something goes wrong, then someone's allowed to generate a ZK proof and give that commitment and say, this is a commitment that I actually proved, and it is not equal to the one that was posted. So that's a high level design behind Eclipse.
Mhm.
The risk zero component to this is just in generating that fault proof or in generating the commitment and showing proof that the commitment that you generated is not equal to the one that was posted on chain. But that's the high level life cycle of a transaction for Eclipse.
I think touching on the security, I think you bring up an important part, but I'm going to save it for later on in the pod. I want to touch on that a little more in the future. If you can take a step back and give the TLDR for why it's important for users and what users maybe need to understand.
Yeah, some prior knowledge is also just comparing to Solana. Like, how does the Solana L1 work, and how is it the same or different?
Right.
So for the Solana L1, you have some proof of stake leader rotation. So you have a leader,
Yep.
they receive transactions, and again, they order those transactions.
Right.
So you can think of that as the same role as the sequencer for Eclipse. So they order a bunch of transactions, they commit to it, and they disseminate those transactions. And that's done using Turbine for Solana.
Okay.
For us, we don't need Turbine because we just don't have that many people to disseminate to. We're posting it to Celestia. In turn, Celestia could totally implement something like Turbine or some other scheme. The difference is
to make it faster if they needed to, kind of thing.
If they wanted to disseminate it, if they wanted to disseminate it in a more
Or is this like a
like
validator, like increasing the amount of
number of,
validators?
it's about like making an optimal ratio of the number of bits transmitted compared to the number of bits of information. So Solana is optimizing so that there isn't that much redundancy. So you always have to have a little bit of redundancy because what if bits get lost? Like the wire is not reliable. Maybe you lose a couple bits here and there. So you
Okay.
want to make sure you can still recover the block even if you dropped a couple packets. But Celestia needs to do more of their erasure encoding is less efficient than that to enable that sampling that I was referring to earlier by lightweight devices. So this is something that theoretically Solana could implement, but it would substantially damage that ratio of number of bits transmitted compared to number of bits of information. So that's the first difference basically, which is that the Celestia erasure encoding is optimizing for verifiability, whereas the Solana erasure encoding is optimizing for bandwidth.
Okay.
So that's the first thing. So now everyone receives the block, everyone executes, and now they need to vote and basically say, do we agree with the end state that the leader computed? So the first difference is how data is made available. That's Turbine versus Celestia.
Okay.
And then the second is how do we ensure correctness? How do we know that the end result that was computed is the correct result? After you compute like 100 transactions or something, how do we all agree and make sure that there was no invalid state transition? How do we know that maybe funds were like mishandled or something like that? So that would be called a safety violation, and that's what voting solves for a proof of stake blockchain, and that's what fault proofs or ZK proofs solve for a rollup.
Okay. Take me through the chain of events, and maybe this will help for clarity as well. You're on Eclipse, a transaction is made, it gets posted to the data availability layer, which is Celestia, and then it goes from Celestia and it goes through risk zero.
The risk zero is only used when a proof is generated. So we could have proved every single transaction.
So is it like it's
zero,
more like a
don't
tree? Like are you choosing when to go through Celestia before settling back to Ethereum? Or are you always having to involve?
So it always. So the idea is that on any blockchain, every transaction needs to be made available. So that's true for L1s. That's true for rollups. We're just all doing it in different ways. So every transaction that
Right.
goes through Eclipse does need to get posted to Celestia, and then the commitment for executing all those transactions is posted to Ethereum.
And then risk zero implemented inside of this.
So that would only happen if that commitment is something that someone disagrees with.
Because you mentioned that risk zero is doing ZK, but I was listening to an old podcast, and you guys are also you're technically an optimistic, even though you're going to have the opportunity to change. Would that mean leaving risk zero behind because they're also ZK, or can they do both? How does that work?
So ZK rollup and
Right.
optimistic rollup is a bit of a misnomer. This is an optimistic rollup if we had to pick one. Really, the reason why
Right.
misnomer is it's a property of the bridge. So the rollup always executes transactions, posts them to a DA layer. Now the question is, how did you secure the bridge? Did you provide a
Yep.
ZK proof of every single transaction, or did you only give proof of the one transaction that was misexecuted? So we're doing the latter, and that's because we don't want to pay the price to ZK proof every transaction. But we could. And in that case, we would still use risk zero. We would just prove even.
Right.
We would use risk zero even more actually, and we would prove everything in
As
that.
I understand optimistic rollups is that it's a 7-day window that there can be to a fraud to be detected, and that's hence the fraud proofs. And are you guys choosing to do this based on a
Mhm.
cost perspective? Is it an efficiency perspective?
Yeah, it's purely about cost. Yeah, we just don't want to prove every single transaction. Money to
Especially in
transaction.
Solana speeds means you're going to have that many more transactions, which when you're settling to
Exactly.
Ethereum could really inflate the cost of it.
Yeah, well, that actually might lower the cost per transaction. In general, for a zk for a recursive zk proof, the more transactions, the cheaper it gets per transaction. But it's still, even if we had like 1,000 transactions a second or something, it would still be fairly. It's at least a penny, right? And that's already too
Okay.
high for
Okay.
Solana level throughput.
We jumped into the tech before I even wanted to get there, but that's good. I like where this is going. I want to back up a second and discuss a little bit more about the protocol at a base layer. In 2022, you guys raised 15 mil over 2 different seed rounds, which actually I heard included Anatoly, which is some credence there. I'm curious. I kind of want to know a little bit more about your guys' runway, what you can tell me about it, and then a little bit more about the team, the size, devs, anything you guys can share.
Yeah, so we were fortunate that I think we caught the end of the last bull market. So we
Perfect.
raised quite a bit. We have years of runway. We probably would do another round at some point in the future, but there's not really any need right now. It looks like we're going to make it to mainnet. And once we're at mainnet, I feel that the mainnet itself is just naturally profitable. So yeah, it's possible we just don't need another round.
Mm-hmm.
The team, there's me, of course.
Mm-hmm.
There's David, who's our head of engineering. He was formerly head of engineering at Thundercore, which is like a popular ZK L1, worked on various L1s, different ZK projects. And then there's VJ, who's our chief business officer. He was head of BD at TRPX, head of BD at Uniswap.
Nice.
He's been in the industry for several years.
Nice. And then there's a series of devs, community, BD, sales, kind of all on the base layer.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, we're pretty small. We're 15 people. It's mostly engineering. And then there's like five of
Okay.
us on the like non-engineering side.
All right. Let's kind of jump into some current questions. Why would somebody use Eclipse over Solana? Why does Eclipse need to exist? Give me the goods.
Good question. Yeah, I think that the main reason is to tap into the Ethereum community. And the biggest unlock, I mean, of course, there's verifiability and there's all these advantages of having fault proofs. And I think it's good. And this is stuff that Solana eventually will adopt as well. But the biggest advantage is that the entire ecosystem is denominated in ETH. That means that your NFTs are in ETH, your assets are in ETH. And in general, for an Ethereum user, given that they're used to using trust minimized bridges and they're used to being able to verify the behavior of blockchains, even using lightweight devices, and they're used to paying in ETH, this is really targeted toward that community rather than toward the same users that have been on Solana. So this is an opportunity to expand the types of users that are using your app. It's also a chance to like access different types of assets that would come through the Ethereum.
Say trust minimized bridges. Walk me through that because bridges are a bit of a sticky thing. I've used Ethereum, I've used IBC, I've used Polkadot. I'm a huge Solana enjoyer, as you well know. And bridges are a part of your guys' kind of core competencies. What is the trust minimized part of a bridge, and where's this guarantees, and can there be?
Yeah, I think one way to view L2s or rollups is just better bridging. And yeah, on the term trust minimized bridge, maybe a better word for it is proof based bridge, meaning that it's using ZK proofs or fault proofs to secure the bridge and therefore reduce the power or reduce the types of things that can go wrong in a short time period. So that's the intuition on why it's better. And it's because anyone can directly look at that one bridge and they can see, okay, is there a ZK proof for every transaction? If you're a full node, you can rerun everything and say, do I agree with everything? Here's a fault proof to show that it's not correct and roll it back. So these are the reasons why proof-based bridges are typically preferred. IBC is even better, right? For IBC, now you can actually verify both sides of the. Well, this is for the typical IBC implementation that comes with Cosmos SDK. Of course, you can change the conditions for IBC so that it's not necessarily doing a state verification against the other chain. But that's like high level idea. It's like you're verifying the quorum of the other chain, so you have their state root, and then you can also verify messages that were passed. And both chains can do this against each other. So IBC is another type of, you could argue, proof based bridge. And then you have like committee bridges, and that's things like Wormhole, for example. You have 19 folks, they're well known entities, you could argue that that's as good as things get in some sense, because at the end of the day, all these bridges need to be upgradable. What if something goes wrong with the bridge? So, I mean, that's
Yeah.
always the weakest link. It's always about who's able to upgrade the bridge, and that's ultimately going to be some committee of some sort. The difference that ideally that committee is something like Aave DAO, MakerDAO. It's the decentralized entities that aren't going to unilaterally cause an upgrade or do malicious activity. Whereas when you have 19 entities, you could theoretically get 10 of those guys to collude. I don't think it's out of the question. So that's
And
the
so this
reason
is
why
sort of
we propose
like
proof-based
there's kind
bridges.
of two kinds of bridges. When you're talking about your ZK style bridges, you're talking like from a transaction flow. But what about from like a user perspective of, getting money onto the ecosystem? Are you guys using, is it mint burn? Is it pool based? Is it going to be like CCTP the way Circle is doing USDC? Is it layer 0? What's the kind of core part of the bridge?
Well, we can't ever burn Ethereum, so it's like a lock and mint. You lock Ethereum on one side, and then
Right.
we mint it as a native token on the other side. And then on the other side, you could burn it or you could lock it, but you need to do one of those two actions and then
I feel
unlock the
like,
ETH on the
yeah,
Ethereum.
bridges always scare me. They probably scare everybody. And I'm sure yourself being involved in the development of quasi L2, let's just say, it's a cause for concern. Like even Wormhole, you mentioned, right? Like they underwent serious exploits in the past too. And I still use their products. So I'm willing to take the risk. But I feel like the way the industry needs to move is the like mint burn, because then there's nothing locked that can be stolen.
Yeah, the issue is now you trust the mint authority, right?
True, true, true. Or you just stay on the L1. Yeah.
Well,
Okay. All right. So Eclipse brings parallelism via the SVM to Ethereum. One of the benefits of you using SVM is that you get to have parallelism. And being that it settles to Ethereum, are there any potential issues there because of the speed that Solana gives versus the speed that Ethereum has?
so settlement is like a bridge, basically. So not really. The settlement is it's a bridge, and it's also defining the native currency of the chain. So this will be where the native token comes from, which is ETH. It goes through this canonical bridge. We post the bridge periodically, but if you look at Optimism, for example, they only post the bridge every 2 minutes, and like nothing breaks, no one dies, and you probably don't even need to post that often. It just depends on how frequently you want people to be able to bridge out. And for a ZK rollup, one of the chief benefits is better composability with the L1. So you'd figure they should post a little more frequently, but you don't really have to. It's just about what properties you want from the bridge. I mean, of course, you do have to pay the Ethereum gas fee to settle, but that basically ends up being something close to zero, because you're just writing some bytes to Ethereum. And there's the unhappy path where you would have to verify a ZK proof on Ethereum, but it's probably okay to pay that cost in the case that there's fraud, given that should be a rare event.
So there's like my non-technical way of seeing it. I see it as a funnel. You've got all these transactions piling in and then, slowly settling to the Ethereum layer.
Yeah, because not every transaction is posted to Ethereum. So that's true that it's all going through the funnel and being posted to Celestia, right? Because Celestia needs to make everything available. And realistically, it's like they're being caught right before they're compressed and batched up, sliced into pieces, and then they're posted to Celestia. So that part's right. But for Ethereum, you can just post think of it as every so often you take a sample of the latest state and then you just post that to Ethereum. And you just do that however many blocks you want, however frequently you want.
Is there drawbacks to that? Like, can you contrast that to how Solana reaches the validation? Does Solana do something similar? Am I missing a core piece of how it works?
Yes.
Or are they posting everything?
So Solana also needs to disseminate all the transactions to every validator. That part's also correct. It executes everything. They vote on the conclusion on whatever the resulting state is. So that part is, as far as like how do you determine that the end state is correct, is the difference between the quorum deciding something, so the validators, versus just saying this is the case and then relying on proofs to determine whether that is true or not. So that's the fundamental difference. Solana could easily adopt this instead, rather than having votes. You additionally also have to provide proof, something like that, or you could provide proof of dishonesty and slash all the guys who are misbehaving. That could happen too.
So it's just two very fundamental ways of running the blockchain. or
Yeah, like
scaling the blockchain?
two ways of figuring out what's the correct end state of the blockchain. After running n
That's
transactions, how do you figure out what's the right resulting state?
okay. Okay, I like that. That's succinct. All right, looking forward a little bit. I've heard you mention that Eclipse brings benefits to both the Ethereum community and the Solana community. Is there anything in particular that you want to pursue with partnerships? Can you speak to me a little bit more about that from a BD perspective? You know, is there any blue chips lined up? Like, talk to me a little bit more about how you're going to build this ecosystem.
So on the Solana side, from Solana Foundation, they're supporting SVM. They've been really helpful.
Yeah.
We have a meeting with them regularly, and we pass projects back and forth and pass ideas. So they've been helpful. And then we also have a grant from them to develop like other types of bridging for the SVM. We chat with Greg, who built the SVM, chat with the Fire Dancer team. So that's all infrastructure stuff. On the dApp side, I find that consumer apps are more closely tied to community, and that can't be forked. So there's not really any reason for us to port consumer apps. We do have a handful of consumer incubations that we're doing on our side. For DeFi and NFT stuff, there are some pretty awesome DeFi apps in the Solana ecosystem. I think it makes a lot of sense for them to go multi-chain, tap into the Ethereum audience. And then for NFTs, the thinking is net new collections. We'll do something around that, have a marketplace, launchpad, and those are the three go-to-market levers for us. There's consumer, which is totally greenfield, DeFi, which we can often rely on existing apps to fill those holes. And it's just basic primitives like spot, perps, clubs, AMMs, borrow land. And there's NFT stuff, which is just getting those primitives down and making sure that we have good collections for people to claim.
Is Eclipse Rust friendly and also EVM friendly as far as dev capabilities go?
So it's
easy to plug
exactly
into on
like,
both sides?
yeah, it's just like developing on Solana. On the EVM side, so we were writing some benchmarks for Solang. We wrote the same contract for both an EVM target and for the SVM bytecode for BPF. And we're benchmarking that right now. It's like some name service example. And we'll release those findings just to show the SVM really is superior from a throughput perspective compared to the EVM. So that's one way that we can support Solidity dApps. And then for supporting EVM bytecode itself, Neon is pretty much the only way to do that right now. And we're thinking through what would be the right collaboration there. It might be Neon team deploying their own instance. We can always run Neon ourselves, and we've actually done that a handful of times for a bunch of SVM app chains that we've run in the past. That's probably not a rabbit hole that we'd want to go down. And it's something that we'd want an external team, like a third party, to manage. So we're not really targeting EVM apps, to be honest. If we talk to an EVM or a Solidity team, then we often try to push them in the direction of writing Rust. Just write natively for Eclipse, because it's just going to be so much more performant when you do it that way.
That makes sense. Okay, let's talk a little speculation. I know that you guys don't have any tokens on the roadmap. You're more of an Ethereum gas focus, but I kind of want actually to lead into why I understand why you're not going to have a token is it's sort of like you need to be able to give it a utility. And a lot of the times that when I hear about tokens that are strictly governance, like the Arbitrum one, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around it. But how do you approach it from a centralization perspective? What are the concerns around centralization if you don't have a token? And what's your guys' thought process there about operating this system in Web3 and in this crypto ecosystem?
So I think the governance token, I used to feel similarly to you, where I thought this seems like a really weak use case for the token. But actually, token-based governance is the only form of decentralized governance that we know of at this point. You could have some kind of proof of authority. We could, and we're actually doing a bunch of governance research right now, given that this is something that's going to be important for Eclipse as we move further along. And we'd want to have some way of measuring how decentralized a community is. And that's something that's, I think, not really super well researched in general. I think Maker's on the forefront of that. And Rune, I think, internally has his own metrics for it. And I don't think it's anything simple. And I'd say that right now, the state of DAOs is not as decentralized as we could be if you look forward however many years. There's going to be more research and thought around that. But this is all to say that I think that's actually a reasonable use case for a token. I think that's not a bad way to go. As far as like other utilities for the token, we don't really have any other reason why we'd have a token. So if it's not that, then I'd probably err away from it.
That's sound. I can get behind that. Okay, let's jump into a couple of tough questions. I was checking your guys' docs, and I didn't really see anything around kind of chain safety and audits and bug bounties. And I want to just ask, because clearly you guys are thinking about safety and audits. Is there public audits available? Are they in the process because you're still in testnet?
Yeah, they're still being audited right now. So we have Halborn doing one. I think we might have Zelic
Nice.
or someone else doing our second one. So we'll have a few audits done, and yeah, the source will be available, so anyone can audit it themselves. They can run the bridge themselves. So that's the thinking on like our open source philosophy, and eventually, of course, Eclipse, like every other project, will be fully open source. So that's the plan.
Will you do a bug bounty with Immunify or Code Arena?
I'd be down for a bug bounty. I mean, ideally we do it at a point where we're very confident there are no bugs. But yeah. we'd definitely be interested in a bug bounty.
Yeah, I've done a lot of research over the last year publicly, and then just have become more and more a fan of protocols doing bug bounties. You just give the white hackers a chance to earn something, and then also find some exploits. But again, not an expert, just an observation.
Yeah, there are so many cases of blockchains not honoring the bug bounties. I don't know if you saw there was one.
Oh, really?
Aptos. Oh yeah, it happens all the time.
Had not heard that. That's cheeky. Okay, that's fair. Totally. Okay, so I was reading an interview with you from a year ago with CoinDesk, and you had stated that Solana SVM and Aptos are fast, but they don't offer enough throughput to enable on-chain anything too computationally intensive like machine learning. And I kind of wanted to know, and as I'm not a traditional tech guy, and though I'm learning more and more all the time, I kind of disagree with that from the sheer scalability, throughput, reliability, and transaction costs. It seems like Solana is perfect for machine learning. So are you saying that Eclipse is going to be better?
So I don't know if Eclipse is actually better for it. They're going to be equally good. But I will say that things like matrix multiplication, running full compute workloads, even just storing the massive amount of data that's typically required for machine learning, I don't think that blockchains are really the right solution for that. But I think co-processors could be. So there's this project called Ritual, who actually our pre-seed lead investor left Polychain, and now he's building that. Co-processors like RISC-0, Axiom, others, that seems like a more viable route to supporting extremely computationally intensive tasks. Where the thinking at that time, during that article, my proposed solution was app chains. But the conclusion I've come to now is that an app chain is overkill for just supporting one complex type of operation. And that is one way of supporting it, to be fair. You embed a precompile, such as there are folks that have embedded entire game ticks or other types of compute within a custom system program. Whereas this alternative is you stay with the shared chain, you don't have to pay for your own app chain, but now you delegate that compute out to someone else, and that's what they do for a living. They just do complex compute, and therefore they've really cut the cost down as low as it can be. So that makes more sense to me as far as the future of how most apps should approach that kind of compute.
Okay, that's fair. I think we're not at a point in the tech to really know for sure which direction it's going to go. And I don't really know too much about what you mentioned with Axiom and RISC-0 and how they're operating.
So if we wanted to actually support machine learning on chain for Solana, for example, all of the validators need to have GPUs now. All of them need to be ready to do crazy matrix multiplication because everyone has to re-execute every transaction. And they could just blindly vote. They could just say, I'm not going to re-execute all the machine learning stuff. But now we're losing trust in our validators. They're just blindly voting regardless of whether they agree with a resulting state or not. So you really don't want that. You want everyone to re-execute everything if you're an L1, or even if you're an L2, you want like someone to be able to efficiently generate a proof of something. And that requires having dedicated hardware for machine learning. So it's not really something that shared chains, in my opinion, should be getting into the business of.
Okay. One more question. In the last podcast that you did with the Bankless guys, the host had said that nobody prefers Ethereum virtual machine or its execution prowess and capabilities. They prefer it because of its network effects, which honestly I think is a bad take. It's kind of like saying that everybody enjoyed BlackBerries in high school, we all used the pearls, and that's the reason why we should keep it. When along comes Apple and it proves to be better tech, and they just dump it. So, is rollups that settle to Ethereum going to make people want to stay if Solana is the better tech? And is that a risk for you with your position?
So I think it's like a couple of different statements packed in there. So EVM is different than Ethereum. And it's also different than rollups on Ethereum, right? Like you can have SVM as a rollup on Ethereum. That's what Eclipse is doing. Some of those have network effects and some of them don't. So, for example, I don't think that there are really network effects built around BlackBerry. Just because you and your friend both have a BlackBerry doesn't mean suddenly you're communicating better or something. I would say that there is network effects around the Apple ecosystem, such as with iMessage. Like the green text, blue text phenomenon is obviously referring to like kind of a distaste of people who don't belong to the Apple ecosystem.
Like so I had with my mother. Get on train, mom.
Exactly. I kicked my mom out of a group chat the other day. But the idea behind like what he was saying was the reason why so many rollups are EVM is because most developers build for the EVM. So that was a natural thing for them to build for. There are fewer developers building for Solana right now. That's just objectively true because there are so many more EVM chains. So that he's explaining why no one had done this already. Why did no one already take Solana and turn into a layer 2? It's because the low-hanging fruit was probably the EVM. And as far as the network effects around settling to Ethereum, that's more about the network effects of ETH, the asset. And a lot of people hold ETH. In general, it's hard to break network effects for currency. So, because it's like all your stuff is denominated in that currency. In general, when we go to the grocery store or something, we're not used to the bread being in US dollars and then the eggs being in, I don't know, Zimbabwe dollars or something. That would be highly unnatural for us to juggle two different types of currency and try to reconcile this psychologically. And that might be okay for investments, but it's still not really, right? When you go onto Vanguard, Fidelity, I want everything denominated in USD. That's what we invest in. And in Ethereum, everything's denominated in ETH. So most people right now, as far as like smart contract blockchains go, hold ETH, and they're using ETH. That's where most of the value and volume sits. I think Solana is a great blockchain. Obviously, I'm very fond of the tech. That's why we're using a lot of it. But we want to tap into those network effects around ETH, the currency. And that's why we're settling to Ethereum. So that's the intuition. It's not really about like which will last longer, because if that's the case, then you're comparing ETH the asset as money to Sol the asset as money. That would be the apples to apples comparison. And I don't know if Sol is really trying to be money in the same way. That's almost like it's more of a Bitcoin Ethereum thing to try to do, and to some degree it requires having a constrained base layer. Because what they've basically done is they're just in the supply-demand curve, they move supply way to the left, and that means that the money is more valuable. So it's more suitable as money because it's less likely to fly around, and it's not viewed as an altcoin.
I see. Yeah, the one thing you mentioned about like Ethereum, one of the network effects, was being that there was so many developers using it. And it's interesting because your approach is actually trying to increase the network effects of Rust developers on Solana, because now you're trying to take the builders of Solana with the Ethereum as money. So you're kind of switching from the original narrative and sort of trying, I guess, in a way to usher in sort of a new effect.
Yeah, it's like the exact opposite of Monad. Monad is taking the EVM, they're saying this is one, let's parallelize it, and let's try to get all the people on this new chain. Whereas we're saying let's keep the money the same, let's keep ETH, but let's use this parallelized VM, which already exists, and it's very battle tested and optimized with access lists and things like that.
Interesting. Okay, nice. I want to thank you for coming on the Dirty Diggler podcast and going through the gauntlet and give you the opportunity. If you got any final thoughts, I know that you guys are talking about your mainnet coming up. Hit me with it.
Yeah, well, the one thing that developers should do is check out our docs. It's docs.eclipse.builders. You can always DM me on Twitter. You can DM anyone on the team. We're very responsive. And we're launching our testnet soon, or our final testnet. That's the exact same code that's going to be run from mainnet. So you can try it out. There's not going to be a UI for the bridge. Shortly after that, we're going to launch the developers only mainnet, or the mainnet for builders, similar to what Base did for builders. Again, no UI for the bridge. We don't want retail users on there. We want it to be for developers. Use the bridge using your developer tooling. Try it out. Get your contracts on there. Test it out. And then early next year, we'll be opening up to the public. So that's the rough timeline for Eclipse.
That's awesome. Where can they find you on Twitter? And then it's Eclipse FND?
Yep, Eclipse FND. And then my personal Twitter, Neel. And then Salami. So my actual last name is Samani. But when I was in college, my mom didn't want me using my last name. So it's Neel Salami. And I'm extremely doxable at this point, so it didn't really stop me.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah.
No, I love that. Okay. And then the final thing I like to do with the guests on the podcast is I want to ask you, what's your thing that's kept you sane throughout the bear markets, through building when you're stressed? Is it go outside? What is it?
I eat a bunch of good food. I just had some Korean food right now. So that's been my thing during the bear market. And I don't know if that's going to keep up during the bull market. Hopefully not.
That's great. Okay. Hey, it keeps you focused and it keeps you building. It works for me. No judgment from Dirt.
Good stuff.
Thanks for coming on the podcast, and I appreciate your time, Neel.
Thanks for having me.